Unter Gleben Glopping Globen. Ladies and gentle people, today's video is going to be a little bit different. Let's talk about the difference between torque and power. You know, horsepower versus torque. How do you understand the difference? Alright. So anyway, let's start out with something a little bit weird, a little bit strange, and we'll get back to it toward the end of the video, alright? Say you're watching a game show. You're watching a game show. You have two contestants and two springs, and each contestant, their job is to push the spring up and down as many times as they can within 30 seconds. But the catch, one spring has a stopper on it, so it only goes down about halfway, and the other spring you have to push all the way down. So that's the catch, right? And you have 30 seconds to push the spring up and down as much as you can. What is this dog gonna do? I'm gonna upset their timing. Hey puppy. Well, you got one of those electronic things, aren't you? We'll say that for later. We're gonna go ahead and come back to the springs in a minute. Now, you got a nut and a wrench. Let's say you have two nuts, two wrenches. Two nuts, two wrenches. And it takes the exact same amount of pressure. Let's say it takes 100 foot-pounds of pressure to break these nuts loose. Or you have one ratchet that's about 1 foot long. Then you have another ratchet that is twice as long. Obviously, the one that's twice as long is going to take less pressure to loosen that nut. But even with the shorter one, you're not going to be pushing 100 pounds of pressure. It's 100 pounds of foot-pounds at the nut, right? But the longer one will be easier because you have more leverage. So that's one way of looking at the difference between torque and U-turns. Torque is how much leverage you have. Horsepower is how much energy you're putting behind the lever. So with the longer wrench, you don't have to push it as hard to break that nut loose. So that's one way of looking at the difference between torque and horsepower, is that horsepower is how much energy you're putting into the lever, and torque is that lever. So you got a longer lever, you got more leverage, it doesn't take as much energy, right? You can get a large displacement V-twin versus a large displacement sport bike. Now the sport bike is going to have maybe 3 or 4 cylinders. So you got 3 versus 2. The V-twin is going to have larger pistons, a longer piston stroke, that's what she said. That's going to create more compression. That's why these engines have a high amount of torque, because more compression will give you more leverage. Remember that longer lever when you're turning that wrench. But then you get the sport bike, same amount or same engine size. You know, you get, let's say, about 1,000 cc's, give or take. They don't have quite as much torque at the beginning, at least. I mean, both of these, since they are bigger engines, they do have a decent amount of torque and horsepower, but the power band is quite different. The pistons are much smaller, there's more of them, and the piston stroke is a lot shorter. Because you have less compression and a shorter piston stroke, these things will rev out at a much higher RPMs, and they're capable of really high RPMs. You got these V-twin shaped engines. Because they have higher compression, if you were to rev them up at higher RPMs, they'll have a tendency to bend and break rods. You could break a rod or something like that because you have such a high amount of compression. Remember the springs I was talking about. So you got shorter piston stroke, smaller pistons, they don't move as far, so you're capable of higher RPMs. You got a longer piston stroke, bigger pistons, because there's only 2 of them. They have more leverage, which is more torque. Hey, there's a Monte Carlo right there. Check it out. And speaking of V-shaped engines, remember the springs I was talking about? The ones where you push one halfway down and you put a stopper on it, so you only have to push it about halfway. You can push it up and down more times in a shorter amount of time because you don't have as much resistance. That is the same as having the smaller pistons and shorter piston stroke. You have less resistance. That's basically that's your basic idea of how torque and the difference in torque and horsepower. So torque is your leverage And horsepower is the amount of energy behind that leverage to get your wheels moving. Any vehicle that has a transmission, first gear is going to have the highest amount of torque. Your higher gears are going to have lower torque, but you're going to be at a higher speed, because it takes a lot more energy to get a vehicle moving up to speed. From 0 to 50 or from 0 to 60, it takes way more energy to get it up to 60 than it does to stay at 60. That's also the reason oftentimes if you're on a mountain road, if you're going up a really long steep hill, it's better to go ahead and just shift down and reduce your speed so you have enough leverage to get up that hill. So there you go, there's your torque, and there's your torque is your leverage. Horsepower is the energy behind that lever. And there's your basic understanding of horsepower and torque. Scooter Boy! Hey y'all, do me a favor. Please click like and subscribe. It helps me big time in the algorithm. And click the bell icon so you know when new videos drop. And go ahead and check out the video on screen. You know you want to.